welcome everybody to RIW Hobbies and Games in Livonia, Michigan. Today we got more spoiler talk. We got Planeswalkers, and historically, Planeswalkers have mostly defined Standard. More than that, they're starting to define Pioneer, starting to define Modern. They are dominating Legacy right now, but that's mostly just because of Oko. But they're all over the place. We got 3 new ones. We got to talk about them.
Let's do it.
First one up, Jace Mirror Mage. Jace is 1 blue, starts at 4 loyalty. It has kicker for 2 colorless. And it says when Jace Mirror Mage enters the battlefield, if Jace was kicked, create a token that's a copy of Jace Mirror Mage, except it's not legendary and its starting loyalty is 1. It has a +1 that says Scry 2. That's it. And it has a 0 that says draw a card and reveal it. Remove a number of loyalty counters equal to that card's converted mana cost from Jace Mirror Mage. Raja, how good is this card?
I think this card is very good. I think, first of all, what a cool design. They gave kicker to a Planeswalker. I mean, that's pretty unique.
I agree. That's really sweet.
I think a 3-mana Planeswalker always deserves to receive more attention than usual just because it's cheap. It means it's going to do powerful things earlier. It's +1, Scry 2, very good. I mean, I think Patrick Chapin wants to create a Scry 3 to almost the card.
Yeah.
So, like, Scry 2 is maybe at least have a card-ish.
Sure.
Definitely gets better in certain situations, but and a Scry 2 plays really well with its 0, which is a loyalty-based, or a CMC-based loyalty removal, right?
Yep.
So you can play on turn 3, +1, make it so that a land is the second card down. You draw for turn, you immediately use the 0, and you get a card, an extra card.
Yep.
So at the very least, you can usually make it so that you're drawing 2 cards every other turn, while, you know, sifting away some of the stuff you don't want to see. I think that the fact that it also scales well in the late game, like usually 3-mana Planeswalker isn't that good on turn 6 or 7, but this one has a kicker, it makes a second copy of itself, and they play really well with each other because now you don't have to wait for the second turn for the first turn's effect to work well with it. Now you just get to do both of them immediately. You get +1 of them and 0 the other. Which one you want to do is going to be contextual. Sometimes you're just so desperate for business that you'll 0 blindly and not have to +1, and then you won't get punished because you'll hit a land anyway. I think the card is just pretty good. I think the fact that you can present 2 Planeswalkers in 1 card in 1 turn is really good because, you know, there's certain situations where you're playing against a creature-based deck and they have exactly 1 creature. And if you play the Planeswalker and you get the value from it, they're going to attack it. But if you play this one, you kick it, you have 2 Planeswalkers, they might actually just ignore both and go for your face again because it's not worth it for them to slowly whittle them down. And so it kind of has like almost like a form of evasion despite not being able to protect itself in the form that it gets a second copy of itself.
Yeah, I would agree. My big thing with Planeswalkers is the ones that protect themselves tend to be much better than the ones that don't. I can't really think of any situations where a Planeswalker that couldn't protect itself was particularly good in Standard. Tameo, I guess, but that was more of like a Nexus of Fate Fog thing when it was like truly dominant. The 4-mana blue-green Tameo, for the record. All the other Planeswalkers that really have dominated mostly protect themselves in some way. They have some way of protecting themselves, whether it be creating tokens to create board presence or directly removing creatures. I think it's important that these Planeswalkers be able to protect themselves, and Jace does not do that. So that is a huge strike against him. That said, your point of making 2 copies is pseudo-protection because they have to choose and attack both.
Or if they're playing like Hero's Downfall effects for their answers,
yep.
Well, now they're only going to kill 1, and you're still going to have 1 left over.
Yeah, and that's really underrated as well, is that it's already hard to kill Planeswalkers to begin with, and the fact that now if they have the kill spell for your Planeswalker, you still get 2 copies. I think that's really important. It is awkward that if you kick it for 5 mana, it's not like a cast thing, it's when it enters the battlefield, so you could pay 5 mana and get it Mystical Disputed and get 0 copies, which, not great. But all that said, I do think the card is powerful. I'm not as big on this card as you are. I think you think it's a little better than I do, which is fine. I will say, though, that, you know, we've brought up the point that Elspeth Conquers Death is one of the best cards coming back from last Standard, and given that, we already have seen the recipe of cheap Planeswalker that doesn't stay in play super long, you know, that can get some value before it leaves, then bringing it back with extra loyalty from Elspeth Conquers Death is really, really powerful, and this card, you know, sets that up perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, you can literally just, like, if you have the ECD on 2 and it's going to pop next turn and you have another target, you can just be confident about your 0 on Jace, because even if you lose it, it's going to come right back. And if you don't, you're okay with that too.
Sure, you still got your Planeswalker. So I think this card's going to be... 3-mana Planeswalkers in Standard have just historically been very, very good.
Yeah, this one's monocolored. This one, it might be more of a sideboard card just because it's going to not be great against decks that are attacking you really aggressively.
Yep.
But even as a sideboard card, this is like the perfect thing to be able to threaten slow decks with just like 2 planeswalkers or 1 planeswalker early that finds you whatever you need.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I do think that when you can scry 4 in a turn in increments of 2, that's really
It's a
powerful.
ton.
That is so you see so many cards over a 2-turn span. You could look at 10 cards from your library, essentially. I mean, that's so strong, and if that was all it did, it wouldn't be enough. But the fact that it also can generate card advantage, if that's the mode you're looking for, is just so good.
Yeah, and you made the point that it doesn't protect itself, but it comes down with 4 loyalty and can immediately plus on turn 3. So having a 5 loyalty planeswalker on turn 3, most board states can't really beat that immediately, right?
It's true.
So
It's
you
true.
will have some activations out of it, even if you can't protect it with your supplemental spells, which is ideally the best way to protect a planeswalker that doesn't protect itself. You use
Sure.
other cards.
Okay, also, I would like to correct myself earlier. I said Planeswalkers don't protect themselves. There's not a pedigree. There is exactly one. It's Narset. And this card does kind of feel like a parallel to Narset. I do think it's worse than Narset,
I think so too.
but not significantly so. I think it's pretty comparable to Narset, and Narset wasn't uncommon, which is weird that kind of card was dominant in Standard, but it really truly was.
Oh yeah.
And this does feel a lot like Narset in the sense that it's just that good value 3-mana Planeswalker.
Yep. I mean, Narset's passive was one of the biggest selling points of the
Yeah,
card.
for sure.
But I agree with what you're saying. It does draw cards, 3 mana,
Yep.
does protect itself very well, same cost.
Narset often played more like a prison piece than a Planeswalker, so kind of easy to forget, but yeah, totally agree. All right, next Planeswalker we have to talk about, Nahiri, Heir of the Ancients. It's 2 red-white, 4 loyalty. It has a +1 that says create a 1/1 white core warrior creature token. You may attach an equipment you control to it. It has a -2 that says look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a warrior equipment card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And then -3, Nahiri, Heir of the Ancients, deals damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to twice the number of equipment you control. How we feel about this one?
I think this card's also good. I think some people have already pointed out, but its +1 makes non-humans.
Yep,
Pairs well with Winota.
sure.
Its +1 finds Winota, because it finds a warrior.
-2 finds Winota.
Sorry, -2 finds Winota.
Yep.
But also finds Embercleave.
Yep.
I think in our top 10 list we had those cards at 2 and 3 respectively.
3 and 4, but yes,
Was it 3 and 4?
it was 3 and 4.
What was number 2?
Adventure creatures.
Good point. You're right. Zach does his homework.
Yeah.
I don't think the -3 is very good. I think the idea of it being a 3 cost hit to being able to do maybe 2 or 4 damage
Yep.
in best case scenarios, not very good. I mean, I think the pluses are enough to like make the card playable, so it's kind of like gravy at that point. But I don't think it's very good.
I think you're wrong about that, and we can get into it. But keep going.
You know what, Zach? I feel like I've been talking a lot here. Let's hear your opinions on the card.
Okay, so I will say that the -3 is definitely going to be the least used mode of the card. So you're not playing it for the -3, right?
Of course not.
You're playing it for the +1 and the -2, and both of those are effects red and white are particularly interested in, right? Because red-white is not the type of color combination that's historically very good at grinding. This card is actually very good at grinding. It is making a 1/1 every turn lets you grind through removal spells. It lets you keep putting equipment on it, but it also lets you, just keep finding warriors and equipment to just keep attaching your creatures, keep building your battlefield. So that's what you're playing it for. But the fact that the -3 can hit other planeswalkers, I think, is really underrated. There's going to be a lot of times where you have an equipment on a creature, and you really want to attack the opponent. And for me, I'm thinking more of like the swords, like Sword of Feast and Famine, Sword of Fire and Ice. There's so many times you have this on your creature, you're like, well, I can kill their planeswalker, but I don't get the trigger. But I could also attack them and get the trigger, and then maybe find a way to deal with the planeswalker. The fact that this can kill planeswalkers is super important, and we have seen historically, planeswalkers that kill other planeswalkers are a really big deal because it's really hard to kill other planeswalkers. So when you can headhunt other planeswalkers with your planeswalker, that's huge. And the fact that she will let you get triggers or deal more damage to the opponent is really good because, even the one we're looking at now, Embercleave, that's the type of card where certainly you could use it to kill another planeswalker, but a lot of the times the damage is going to be wasted, right? You might have to kill a planeswalker that has 3 loyalty and you're attacking it for like 8 with your Embercleave, and you don't really want to do that. But Nahiri can just pick that one off, and then you can deal 8 to their face.
Yeah, I don't question the validity of being able to deal damage to a creature or planeswalker on a planeswalker. I think that's great. I think it's the stipulation of having to have equipment in play already when you
Sure.
want to do it. So I think there's a cap on the number of equipment you can play in a deck. It's just kind of like a card that all of them usually have diminishing returns.
Sure.
Whether they're legendary in the form of Evercleave or just like you need to have more bodies and less equipment
Sure.
kind of problem. And like the times where you want to be dealing 2 or 4 damage is usually like the early to mid game, And I'm worried that like by the time you have enough equipment, if ever, to kill some of these creatures, they're not going to matter as much anymore. And like 3 loyalty is a lot to, because it's an opportunity cost. You're still not
Sure.
activating its -2 to dig for more cards or +1 to make more threats.
I mean, I
And
agree
if
with
you have
all
equipment
that.
in play, then it's nice to be able to transfer them all over for 0 mana with a +1.
Okay, so I do agree with all of that. I'm not disagreeing on, but you said opportunity cost. We're not playing the card for the -3. The -3 is just gravy, right?
It is. It is.
And sure, this doesn't have like a game-winning ultimate, but you know this card has been compared to Elspeth Knight Errant a lot in the fact that they both plus to make 1/1s, and planeswalkers that plus to make tokens, there's not very many of them, and all of them have tended to be quite good actually.
Agreed.
So that alone is very good, and Elspeth was also the type of planeswalker that didn't ultimate very much.
No.
It had an ultimate, and you could use it, but oftentimes you were better off just continuing to make 1/1s. So I don't think that this card is hurt by the fact that it doesn't have an ultimate. Sure, you might want it, but I don't know, man. The fact that like when you need to get their creature off the table so you can get an attack in, or when you need to do that last 2 points of damage to a planeswalker so you can go face with your attack with your equipment, that just sounds so strong to me.
Yeah, I mean, how many equipment are you playing in your deck?
Well, I mean, we still need to see, right? It's all
Right.
contextual, because
Of course.
if something like Living Weapon exists, then all of a sudden the numbers change.
Well, I think they've already announced all the mechanics for the set, so it's not going to be in this set.
Well, okay, so you say that, but we've seen things in the core sets recently, like Ancestral Blade, right? Doesn't say Living Weapon, but for all intents and purposes, it had
I
Living
see what
Weapon.
you're saying. Okay.
So maybe Living Weapon, the mechanic itself, is not in this set, but it is certainly possible that we see equipment like that, and I would not be shocked if they, just based on the fact that there's an equipment-themed set, a card like Ancestral Blade could easily be reprinted. And that,
For sure.
for the record, that's just a 2-mana 1/1 that comes with an equipment that gives +1/+1 attached to it, so it's, in all intents and purposes, a white grizzly bear that leaves behind a short sword.
Right.
And that's really good, and that's the type of card that this deck would, like a Nahiri deck, would be very interested in playing. And if we see something like that, this card, I think, gets a lot better.
Yeah, my biggest concern is that people are going to build these decks where they're only playing Embercleave, or maybe Embercleave and like one Shadow Spear, or whatever, one equipment from the new set, and then you're basically almost always going to have either 0 or 1 in play, and it's just not going to be very good.
I mean,
you can never have more than one Embercleave, so even if you have 4
true.
copies, it's really just always going to be 1.
If that's the case, then sure, the -3 will be a lot worse. But we don't know the rest of the set. I mean, it is totally possible we see something like a Stoneforge Mystic. I don't think we're going to see exactly Stoneforge Mystic, but I wouldn't be shocked if there's like a 2 or 3 mana creature that ETBs and searches your library for an equipment.
For sure. Yeah, and I think we're harping too much on the -3. I think the power still just obviously lies within +1 and the -2.
I mean, I think the power of this card relies with working
Winota.
insanely with Winota, but, you know, well, that's fine. All right, so let's touch on the last Planeswalker here.
This was spoiled today.
This one got, today. Nissa of Shadowed Boughs. It is 2 black-green for a 4 loyalty Planeswalker, and it has Landfall as a static ability. And it says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a loyalty counter on Nissa of Shadowed Boughs. And then it has a +1 that says, untap target land you control. You may have it become a 3/3 elemental creature with haste and menace until end of turn. Notably until end of turn, it doesn't stick around. It's still a land. And it has a -5 that says you may put a creature card with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands you control onto the battlefield from your hand or graveyard with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. No ultimate, only 2 abilities, but this card still looks really strong to me.
I agree. It's similar to Jace, where it's got a mechanic +2 abilities.
Yep.
And Landfall's a cool mechanic. We've never seen a Planeswalker with that before. I think that this is going to be pretty hard to get down with damage. I think between the fact that she starts with 4 loyalty at 4 mana, has a +1, that's probably the most important ability that it has.
Yep.
And then has Landfall, which works well with Fable Passage. You can just start stacking loyalty on there and make it really hard to take down with damage. So I guess that makes it so that you have to evaluate how good the abilities are, how good is Nissa when she stays in play.
Sure.
I think the +1, obviously a step down from the previous Nissa because it doesn't stick around. It's just a temporary thing. But it does have Menace, so it's a little better, more evasive at attacking.
Yep.
I guess it's better against sweepers, in that your threat is staying a non-creature during your opponent's turns. And the -5 is really hard to evaluate because, like, it's cool that you reanimate something, but, like, it says you can play from your hand, which I think is kind of weird because why don't you, if you're wasting 5 loyalty from your Nissa, why aren't you just casting that card from your hand?
Sure. So I do agree that the -5 looks weird, but I will say there are some historical precedents for types of cards that are really good with an effect like that, and we'll get into it in a second, but I wanted to touch on the +1. We just said it with Nahiri. Planeswalkers that can kill other Planeswalkers have historically been very, very good in Standard, and this Nissa is particularly good at it because it creates an evasive body that can hasty deal 3 damage to another Planeswalker, and that's a plus. Now, obviously the land doesn't stick around, so you're not getting value out of that, but you are getting value from removing their Planeswalker from the battlefield, and that, I think, is super powerful.
Yeah, and we talked about how, historically it's been important to be able to protect it, but because this has so much loyalty, it's really hard to kill.
Yep, and there are cards like Fabled Passage in Standard, so it's very realistic that you could play this on turn 5, plus it, put it up to 5, play a Fabled Passage right after that. It's 7 loyalty going into your opponent's 5th turn. That's so much.
Yeah.
Okay, so on the -5, you said it's weird. I agree that it's a little strange. I do think it's important to have a place to put a lot of loyalty, because it does feel like this card's going to end up having a lot of loyalty. And it is weird that it reanimates stuff like that, especially when it has to be equal to the number of lands, right? But I will say, there was an effect like this that absolutely dominated Standard, I want to say 2 years ago, and it reminds me a lot of 5-mana Liliana, which was Liliana Death's Majesty, and its pairing with Scarab God. There were more expensive creatures you could put in play than Scarab God in that format, certainly. You could have reanimated something that cost more, but reanimating a creature that has an expensive activated ability that's just absolutely bananas is what you want to be doing with this, right? And that's your point about, well, you could just cast it. Sure, in a lot of creatures you could just cast it, but if you're going to do it where the creature is more than its casting cost with like an activated ability, it essentially lets you get a lot more mana out of the turn, and I think that's really powerful with this card.
Yeah, so I guess maybe we'd have to think about some of the ones that do that in Standard right now. I think one example that comes to mind is Kenrith.
Sure.
Kenrith has a ton of ways to use your mana, so if you're able to put it in play for free, you can use him to reanimate something else, or maybe just draw cards, give it haste.
Yep.
So that's probably a decent example for something that can use the ability to good use.
Yeah, Kenrith is a great one, and I'm sure we'll see other ones. Another thing that is interesting to do with it is maybe you have something like an Avenger of Zendikar, which isn't in Standard, at least that we know of yet, but landfall is in the set, so maybe something like that where you want to put this in your play to start, or put this in play to start your turn, then you get to play your land, maybe you can cast a card like Cultivate and get even more effect out of it, and really go off the landfall creature in a deck that's kind of rampy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah, so given that this card is templated the way it is, I wouldn't be shocked if there's a lot of ways to abuse that -5.
Yeah, I just thought of another one, not to just keep going off of this, but like Blue Chronos. If you put Blue Chronos from your hand into play,
Yep.
it has more stats, so which means it can survive more fights, and you can use the mana immediately to do those fights.
Yep.
And then obviously this isn't just a hand thing. I think the more impressive aspect of it is that it reanimates cards from your graveyard.
Sure.
So you're actually generating card advantage in that situation. It makes them a little bigger. I think it's a cool card. I don't know. I can't really think of a place that it slots into like naturally yet, but it's
Sure.
definitely be a card that you're gonna build around for sure. And like when you're playing decks that, I don't know, don't want to have all their eggs in one basket, it's kind of nice to be able to diversify your threats.
Yeah.
And a threat that doesn't die during your opponent's sweeper during their turn.
Totally agree. And you're like, the point about bringing it back from your graveyard, I think, is really interesting because, like the Scarab God, that card was pretty powerful because it could never really die. And this kind of does a similar thing in the sense that, like, okay, I put my big thing into play, they killed it, but this has infinity loyalty because every time you put a land into play, it keeps going up. I'm just going to put it back into play again next turn, get the effect that I'm playing it for, like a Kenrith, they kill your Kenrith, boom, reanimate, put it back, Kenrith back into play, reanimate something else. Just do some crazy stuff with it. So I would not be shocked if... I think this card on its face looks like the worst of the 3 Planeswalkers, and I would not be shocked if it ends up being one of the best.
I can see that for sure.
Okay, so that's all we have for the Planeswalkers today. Thanks everybody for joining us. We really appreciate all the content, all the love people have been showing us. It's been awesome. Remember, if you want to support what we're doing here, we would really appreciate it if you leave a like, comment on the video with things you maybe agreed with, disagreed with on the Planeswalkers.
Yeah, tell us what your favorite Planeswalker is.
Definitely. What are you most excited for? So with that, we'll talk to everybody later.
See you guys.